Hi, everyone, and welcome to my next talk in the Science and Religion series. So, as you can see, this one is on the parting of the Red Sea. So, if you haven't watched the talk right before this, you don't have to watch it to understand this one, but they do kind of go together. So, the talk right before this one was on the plagues of Exodus. So, in the biblical account, Moses is called by God to go to Egypt to talk to the Pharaoh to release the Israelites so that they can go out into the promised land. Pharaoh says no. That's where we get the 10 plagues. Finally, after the 10th plague, Pharaoh says, yes, take your people and go. And so that's kind of where we're at now in the story. So, like I said, the Israelites have been released by Pharaoh after that last plague, the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn male. Pharaoh's heart was hardened again, but even though he was like, okay, I'm gonna let them go. After a little bit of time, his heart is like hardened again. Even though it was softened due to the 10th plague, then it gets hard again. It's kind of like this back and forth with Pharaoh. And then he decides, oh, wait. All my slaves are gone, and I'm going to chase them and kind of bring them back. So he ends up chasing the Israelites and trying to bring them back into slavery. At this time, the Israelites are encamped by the Red Sea when Pharaoh's army is starting to kind of arrive. And so now the Israelites cry out to Moses because they feel like they're kind of stuck. Like, here is Egypt, here, Pharaoh's armies are coming, and then the other way is the Red Sea, which, how are they going to cross? They've got, children and women and cattle and all of this. So they're like, we're either going to be dragged back into slavery, which will be harsher because Pharaoh's going to be mad at us, or they're just going to kill us. So this is where kind of the scene is set. So I think it would be best just for us in this case to kind of go through the scriptures first and then talk about what could be the scientific explanation for how the Red Sea parted. So this story is found in the book of Exodus in chapter 14, starting in verse 16 and continuing. So after, this is kind of happening and the Israelites are crying out to Moses, God commands Moses and says, raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the water so the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground. I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they will go in after them, and I will gain glory through Pharaoh and all his army, through his chariots and his horsemen. The Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I gain glory through Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. So he's asking Moses to kind of raise up his staff and stretch it out over the Red Sea so that it will be parted, and then the Israelites can cross. And then he's letting them know that the Egyptians are going to follow them, but that his glory will still be kind of happening. But they don't quite know what that means. So then in verse 19, it says, Then the angel of God, who had been traveling in front of Israel's army, withdrew and went behind them. So before he was kind of in front of the Israelite army, in front of the Israelites, kind of directing their path. So they were kind of following. And now this pillar of cloud is going to move from in front and stand behind them. So the pillar of cloud also moved from in front and stood behind them, coming between the armies of Egypt and Israel. Throughout the night, the cloud brought darkness to one side and light to the other side. So neither went near the other all night long. So before it was in front, now it's behind, kind of separating the two, kind of giving time for the parting of the Red Sea to happen and for God's work to be done. So then in verse 21, it says, that Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and on their left. So they kind of, as you can see in this picture, Moses stretches out his hand, and then the water is going to be divided as to like a wall, and there's like a path in between these two sides of this wall of water. Then in verse 23, we read, the Egyptians pursued them, and all Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen followed them into the sea. During the last watch of the night, the Lord looked down from the pillar of fire and cloud at the Egyptian army and threw it into confusion. He jammed the wheels of the chariots so they had difficulty driving. And the Egyptians said, "Let's get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." So very, very late, kind of like right before it's going to transition from being night into day. That's kind of the last watch of the night. So the Egyptians are obviously going to be very tired because they've been kind of up all night. God kind of throws them into some confusion. Now their wheels are getting jammed, so they're having trouble kind of crossing over this dry ground. And they start to kind of realize, okay, these are the same Egyptians that experienced those 10 plagues. And they're like, the Lord is still fighting for the Israelites against us. Let's just get out of here. And so that's where we're at in verse 25. And then in verse 26, it says, "Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Stretch out your hand over the sea so that the waters may flow back over the Egyptians and their chariots and horsemen.' Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak, the sea went back to its place. The Egyptians were fleeing toward it, and the Lord swept them into the sea. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and horsemen. The entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea, not one of them survived." So Moses raises up his hands at the beginning of the day at daybreak as the light's coming through. The sea kind of goes back to its place. So these walls of water that were formed go back down. The water kind of overflows and takes over the men, the chariots, the horses, and no one kind of is able to escape. So kind of gives you an idea of the immensity and how quick this return of the water occurred. Then in verse 29, "But the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with the waterfall on their right and on their left. That day the Lord saved Israel from the hands of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore. And when the Israelites saw the mighty hand of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and in Moses his servant." So then the Egyptians realized, okay, they crossed safely. Then, the Lord saved them, allowed them to safely cross, but then wiped out the Egyptians. They see the Egyptians lying dead, and now they're kind of like in a fearful awe of the Lord. They put their trust in him even more, even after all the plagues that occurred, and in Moses, who was his servant and kind of their guide, their leader. So we read this account in the Bible, and the reason I kind of went through all the verses is because I want you to see that the Bible actually offers some very specific meteorological information in these passages. So it talks about how there was a strong east wind that started during the night. So during the night, the strong east wind came in. They also say that it took all night. So this wasn't a strong wind, and then all of a sudden, very quickly, we have this wall form. It took some time for this to occur. So strong east wind took all night, and then it turned the sea into dry land. So now we see there's some dry land that's being visible, being formed there. And the water forms a wall. So this is very specific. So the water forms a wall, and it says that as the Israelites were crossing on this dry land, that the water was on a wall on their right and on their left. So it wasn't just one side, it was on both sides and kind of made like a little wall tunnel for them to kind of walk through. So there's a water tunnel that they kind of walk through, and they're on dry ground. And then at dawn, the sea returned kind of back to its normal depth, and the waters covered the chariots and the chariot drivers. So this is the biblical account. So let's talk about what are the scientific possibilities to kind of explain this. So in a 1992 paper by Nof and Nof Paldor, they kind of investigated two possible scientific explanations. These are kind of the only two explanations that really kind of stand as the closest options. So the first one is a tsunami. So it's thought that maybe a tsunami generated by either an earthquake or a landslide or a volcanic eruption is what caused this dry ground and the movement of the water. A second option is a mechanism called a wind setdown, in which winds drive back the sea. So here I show you the pictures of both Doran and Nathan, so you could just see their faces. and know who they are. And so now let's just go through each of these possible explanations. So first is a tsunami. So we know that a tsunami usually occurs from an earthquake. It could also occur from a landslide or a volcanic eruption, just because that also is seismic activity. And so the question would be, well, how probable is that? Well, the area where the Red Sea is located is actually highly seismically active. So the probability of there being an earthquake or something of that nature is pretty high. So that's pretty reasonable. Okay. And this would actually, with a earthquake or something of that nature, and causing a tsunami, it would actually cause the water to draw back from the coast, and then you'd have a lot of dry ground. So that kind of does fit parts of the biblical account, a tsunami does. But a tsunami doesn't cover all of it. So some of the things that a tsunami doesn't explain is that strong east wind. So tsunamis, they do not require any wind or any sustained wind. So a tsunami can happen with even no wind at all occurring. So that kind of doesn't really explain that. There's no controlled timing. So when it occurred and the length of time. So it says that it took all night long for this to happen. And then all of a sudden the walls fall. And so most of the time that withdrawal of the water for a tsunami does not take an entire night for it to occur. And also, when we have a tsunami, if you've ever seen this, and in my picture, this is a graphical display of this, the water is receding, and then as it comes back, it's kind of coming back as one big wall. So you don't get these two walls. You don't get kind of like this water tunnel that you walk through. You've got dry ground and the water's here. So you would only have a wall of water on one side. So there's no real mechanism for also the targeted destruction, because with a tsunami and the way this works, they would be able just to run back this way across the dry ground. And so it doesn't quite cover all the explanation. So this explanation of a tsunami was actually rejected by Nof and Paldor in favor of the wind set down. And the wind set down is the more preferred scientific explanation. So what is this wind set down? So a wind set down is actually the opposite of a storm surge. And if you're not familiar with that, that's okay. I'll explain it. So wind set down occurs when wind, that's one of the points of the name, wind set down. So you have to have strong winds. And this occurs when wind, sometimes it occurs in combination with tides, but it doesn't have to be tide specific. But if it happens at the same time as a tide coming in or out, then it will kind of exasperate the effect of the wind set down. So this occurs when the wind drives water abnormally far from the coast. So you can kind of see a picture of that here on the screen. And so based on the scripture, Nof and Paldor concluded the following based on what they kind of got from the scripture we just read. So it said that it would be an east wind. And the type of wind that we would need is about a speed of 20 meters per second or 44.7 miles per hour, depending on your preferred system of units. And it also said that it took all night. So the duration was overnight. What were the effects? We would see that the sea level would drop of about 2.5 meters to 8 feet. So we know kind of the depth of the Red Sea. So we would have to have a massive drop of that sea level for then the land to be exposed. And Nof and Paldor, kind of based on the explanations from scripture, thought that the location for this crossing would be the northern end of the Red Sea near the Gulf of Suez, and that there is the possible existence of a submarine ridge or land bridge. So you may have heard about these, like if you're walking out into the water and then it's really deep, and then all of a sudden you get to kind of like a land part where you can kind of stand up and you're kind of further out away from the coast, but you can kind of stand. So that would be a submarine ridge or a land bridge. So here's a visual of kind of the wind set down mechanism. So here you would have the exposed seabed here on the left, and you could see kind of the original water level would be right up to that exposed seabed. And then you'd have the strong east wind. So the wind's coming and it's pushing the water. And so as you would see, the water is going to kind of start being pushed to the east. And then you would have a temporary land bridge. So the water would go from this original level down to whatever is the basin or that lower level underneath the water, the seabed level. And then you would have kind of a temporary land bridge. So this is what it looks like for the mechanism for a wind sit down. Set down, sorry, not sit down, set down. Now, another group besides Nof and Paldor, another group, Drews and Han, also decided to do a more recent study in 2010. And because of more advanced technology, they wanted to do some computer simulations. And they did these computer simulations kind of focusing on what was the historical topography at that time to kind of both determine the location and what would the conditions be. And so remember I said that Nof and Paldor thought it was on the north end of the Red Sea, the Gulf of Suez. So here's the Red Sea, if you can see my cursor, and it kind of goes along this direction. Okay. And so the Nof and Paldor said it would be in this northern end of the Red Sea. Now, Drews and Han thought that the site was on the Mediterranean coast. So they estimated it to be further up here, around the Lake of Manzala. So it was the Lake of Tanis at that time, but the name for it now is the Lake of Manzala. So around this location is where they thought the crossing would occur. And their estimates, based on what was needed for this to occur, is that they would need a wind set down of 28 meters per second or 62 miles per hour, which was actually very similar to what Nof and Paldor had suggested based on their analysis. And that this would cause a 3 to 4 kilometer or 1.8 to 2.5 mile long land bridge. So a pretty good distance of a land bridge would occur. And this is important to note that it would remain open for around 4 hours. So we said that it would take, it's going to take a while for the Israelites to cross, and it would take a while for this, land bridge to kind of open up. So as it's opening up, it gives time for the Israelites to cross, get to a safe location, and for the Egyptians to kind of follow and be deep enough in that they couldn't very quickly escape. So what about the pursuing Egyptians? So we kind of are looking at this wind set down, the winds are going to blow, and we've got this land bridge, and they're coming across. Well, what about this sudden drop in of the water coming down and overtaking the Egyptians? How does that work in a wind set down situation? Well, this can happen in one or two ways. So the reason this is working is because of that east wind coming in and pushing the water. So if the wind speed has suddenly dropped, so it's not as strong of a wind, then it's not going to be able to push that water. So if it's not going to be able to push the water is going to immediately go back. Or instead of the wind blowing this way and pushing the water, if there's a change in direction, if it's going this way, or even backwards, now that's also going to affect the wind, the water being pushed back. So both of these are explanations to why the waters would just rush back kind of rapidly. And Nof and Paldor's calculations suggest that the dry area would actually be completely flooded in as little as 4 minutes. So you've got this wall of water and this dry ground, kind of this water tunnel, as I am describing it. And we said that it's going to be kind of a longer distance. And so if you kind of are noticing the wind is changing directions or speed, and you're thinking, oh, we should get out of here, like in scripture where the Egyptians are like, oh my goodness, God's protecting the Israelites. Our wheels are getting stuck. Maybe we should get out of here. They only have 4 minutes, and as little as 4 minutes to kind of turn around and get out of there. So it's not very much time given the length, the kilometers distance of this land bridge. So kind of leaves no hope for escape if you are in the middle of this land bridge in a wind set down situation. So I also wanted to show you some pictures from the simulation that was done. So this is the computer model simulation that was done in that later 2010 study. So we have the strong east wind over the Nile Delta. So this is the topography of what the Nile Delta would have looked at that time. So that's a historical topography. And so here in this first picture here, this is where it is thought that they would have crossed. So near the Lake of Tanis, which is the Lake of Manzala now. And so this would be the area that they would cross. So this is what they would look like at time zero. So at time zero, we have this topography. And then in within 6 hours, you can already see if this wind is coming and kind of pushing, you can already start to see that some of this land is getting to be exposed. We can see that the water is getting pushed over here towards the left, and more of this land is being exposed. And then within 12 hours, we have a greater exposure of land. And so then they're able to kind of cross on this land bridge into this area. And this you can also see where they would have kind of water on the left and on the right. So as they're kind of crossing over into this area to be able to walk across, they'd have water on both sides, similar to that biblical description. And this would be kind of a temporary crossing path for them to be able to walk over. And so this was the kind of the computer simulation, the model that was done in that study. Now you may ask yourself, well, does this happen? Do we have any modern day examples of this happening? And we actually have several modern day examples of wind set down. So a kind of more recent but still older historical example is in 1882, also in the Eastern Nile Delta, so in that kind of same geographical region of the world. Major General Sir Alexander B. Toloff reported some of the exact same descriptions and conditions of the same wind set down or same conditions that happen in the biblical account. So description of wind set down happening and mirrors the biblical account. Now, some more modern observations by kind of a more, I guess, trustworthy witness would be from NOAA, which is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And they actually record wind set down events on a regular basis. So on Lake Erie, which is in the United States, on the western end, that area experiences wind set down events almost every few years. And the order of magnitude is 2 meters to 6.5 feet. So this is very similar to that amount that we were talking about from the biblical record that was kind of studied, which was closer to about 2.5 meters or 8 feet. So we're still seeing something about on the same magnitude as what was believed to happen in the biblical account. Now, that is just on a lake, kind of just with wind. But we can also see something happening, say it's not wind set down, or maybe the wind set down is occurring because of some outside natural influence. So Hurricane Francis that occurred in September of 2004 in Florida in the United States. Also, this caused kind of similar conditions. At this time, because of the great winds that occurred from the hurricane, we had a 1 meter or about 3.2 foot drop in water level. And then very quickly, well, I guess somewhat quickly, 9 hours later, it rose to 1.5 meters or 5 feet above sea level. So it was here, it went 1 meter down, and then went that 1 meter up, and then 1.5. So it went from a -1 meters all the way to 1.5 above sea level within the 9 hours, which is kind of similar to the overnight description that we have in the biblical account of it kind of separating away from the land and then coming back. So, what are some key takeaways from this kind of review of the biblical account and the scientific explanations? So, we see here that the biblical account includes specific, testable physical details, which I think is really important. Now, obviously, the Bible was not written as a historical scientific textbook, but we do get some scientific and testable pieces of data from the biblical account. We also see that wind set down provides a plausible and scientifically supported mechanism. So, this is a scientific explanation that could have been how God chose to allow for the Israelites to cross the Red Sea. The timing, location, and coordination that was found in both of these studies, in the 1990 study and in the mid 2000 study, the 2010 study, that they both align closely with the biblical description. And the event reflects not only natural processes, but intentional and precise divine action. So, my question to you is, we have a scientific kind of explanation, plausible explanation, but the timing of it occurring and this wind sat down occurring at the same time that the Israelites happen to just be there as the Egyptians are, pursuing them, kind of also shows some divine intervention potentially. So that's something for you to kind of take away and think about as you are reflecting on this talk. So thank you so much for coming to my talk. Here are some of just the few references, including both of those studies that I mentioned, the Nof and Paldor study from the 1990s, and then the Drews and Hand study from the 2010s period. You can also look on YouTube and see some of the videos of the simulations that I kind of had pictures of in this talk. Thank you so much, and I hope you come back to my next talk.